The house was quietest in the hour, before dawn, and that was when Daniel found himself most awake. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. The steam long since surrendered to the cool morning air. Ember light came slow and gentle through the window above the sink, painting soft shadows across the worn surface of the table, across the lines on his face that hadn't been there a year ago. He wasn't really looking at the coffee. His eyes had drifted, as they always did in these still moments, to the refrigerator behind him, where a single crayon drawing was taped at a crooked angle. It was a picture of 3 stick figures standing under a yellow sun with rays like spider legs, a tall one, a medium one, a small one holding both their hands. His daughter had drawn it months ago before everything changed, and he had never had the heart to take it down. Now there were only 2 of them in this house, but the third figure still smiled up from the page as if nothing had been lost. Daniel breathed in slowly, feeling the ache settle into his chest, the way it did every morning, familiar now, almost a companion. When Sarah left, she had taken so much. The good dishes, the framed photographs, the comfortable couch they'd picked out together, the savings they'd built over 6 years, even the curtains she'd sewn for the living room. She had taken the things that made a house feel finished. But she had not taken everything. She had left behind a 4-year-old girl named Lily, asleep down the hall, who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and who depended on Daniel for every single thing in this world. And somewhere in the leaving, in all her careful subtraction of the life they'd shared, Sarah had not realized that what she'd left behind was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Daniel had not known he was capable of this kind of love until it was the only thing holding him upright. He turned the mug slowly in his hands, watching the way the light caught the chip on its rim, and he let himself remember the night she'd told him she was done. There had been no shouting, no thrown plates, nothing dramatic enough to make sense of it later. Just a quiet announcement at this very table that she felt like she was disappearing inside this life, that motherhood and marriage had become a weight she could no longer carry, that she needed to find herself again. He had asked about Lily. He remembered the long silence that followed, the way she'd looked at her hands, the way she'd finally said that he was the better parent anyway, that Lily was safer with him, that she would visit. The visits had grown rare, then rarer, then folded into silence. Daniel had stopped waiting by the window. He'd stopped checking his phone for messages that didn't come. Instead, he'd learned to do the things he never thought he'd have to do alone. He'd learned the rhythm of a child's day, the small rituals that stitched the hours together. And every morning he sat here, in this quiet, gathering himself before the day began, because a little girl was going to wake up soon, and she would need him, to be steady, to be present, to be enough. He took one last sip of the cold coffee and set the mug down gently. From down the hall, he heard the soft creak of a small body shifting in bed, the first signs of waking. He looked once more at the drawing, at the 3 figures under the spider-legged sun, and he let himself believe, just for that one quiet second, that they were still going to be okay. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to spill cream-colored light across the worn hardwood floors, Lily was awake and dressed in the mismatched outfit she'd insisted on choosing herself, a purple shirt with a green polka-dotted skirt and 1 yellow sock. Daniel had learned long ago not to fight these battles. There were enough real things to worry about without quarreling over the color of socks. He knelt down in front of her now, his knees protesting against the hard floor, and he reached for the zipper of her little jacket. It was the puffy one with the small, frayed cuff where she'd chewed on it during a long car ride. The zipper always stuck halfway up, and he worked it gently, patiently, the way you learn to do everything when you're doing it, for someone so small and so trusting. Their foreheads nearly touched as he leaned in, and he could smell the strawberry shampoo in her hair, the faint sweetness of childhood that he knew he would miss someday when she was grown and gone, and these mornings were only memory. "Daddy," she said, her voice still thick with sleep, "are we going to the park today?" He smiled at her finally, freeing the zipper and pulling it all the way to her chin. "Maybe later," he said, "if you eat all your breakfast and we get through the morning without any spills." She considered this with the seriousness of a tiny judge weighing a difficult case, then nodded solemnly, accepting the terms. He sat back on his heels and looked at her, really looked at her, the way he sometimes forgot to do, in the rush of getting through each day. She was so much like Sarah, and so much like himself. A small blend of two people who had once promised each other forever. But where he had expected to feel bitterness, he felt only a fierce protective tenderness that surprised him every time it rose up in his chest. This child had not chosen any of this. She had not chosen the empty rooms, or the missing mother, or the way her father sometimes had to turn away to wipe his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She had simply kept loving him, kept reaching for his hand, kept asking about the park with the same hopeful innocence she'd always had. And in that, Daniel had found something he hadn't expected to find in the wreckage of his marriage. He'd found a reason. He smoothed down the collar of her jacket and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. Ah! The room around them was sparse now, stripped of so much that had once filled it, but the morning light made it warm somehow, made the bareness feel less like loss and more like a clean beginning. He had read somewhere that children don't need a perfect home, they need a present parent, and he held on to that thought like a man holding a rope in a storm. "Where's Mommy?" Lily asked then, the question arriving as suddenly as it always did, with no warning, no build-up, just the simple curiosity of a child who didn't yet understand. Daniel felt the familiar, tightening in his throat. He had practiced the answer 100 times, had read books about how to talk to children about absence, had rehearsed gentle truths in the bathroom mirror. "Mommy needed to go away for a while," he said softly, "but I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." Lily seemed satisfied with this, as she usually was, and she reached up to pat his cheek with her small hand, a gesture so tender and unguarded that it nearly undid him. "Okay, Daddy," she said. Then she grinned, that gap-toothed grin that could fill the emptiest room, and announced that she was very, very hungry, and that everything else would simply have to wait. The bathroom was small, and the mirror was speckled with old water spots, but the morning light came in warm and white, reflecting off the glass and filling the little room with a soft glow. Lily stood on her tiptoes on the step stool, her chin barely clearing the edge of the sink, while Daniel stood behind her with a comb in one hand and his other hand resting gently on the crown of her head. Around his wrist he wore a small pink hair tie, the way he always did now, looped there like a tiny bracelet so he'd never have to hunt for one in the chaos of the morning. He'd learned to braid by watching videos late at night after Lily was asleep, his big rough hands fumbling clumsily through tutorials meant for delicate fingers. The first few times had been disasters, lopsided and loose, falling apart before they even reached the bus stop. Lily had patiently let him practice on her, sitting still with the saintly tolerance of a child who understood, in some wordless way, that her daddy was trying. And he had tried. God, how he had tried. There was something about a man's hands learning to do a thing they were never built for. Something about those weathered fingers, scarred from years of working with tools and metal and the rough business of providing. Gently weaving 3 small strands of a little girl's hair into something neat and lovely. He divided her hair into sections now, the way he'd taught himself, holding each piece with a focus that bordered on reverence. Lily watched him in the mirror, her eyes following the movement of his hands. And she hummed a little tune to herself, some song she made up that had no real melody but made her happy all the same. "Daddy," she said, "you're getting better at this." He laughed softly, a low, warm sound. "Am I?" he said. Lily nodded with great authority. "Mama used to do it faster," she said, "but yours are getting straighter." The words landed gently, without malice, just a child's honest observation. but they pressed against the bruise that never fully healed. He kept his hands steady. "Well," he said, "your old dad is learning new tricks." He crossed the strands over one another, slow and careful, watching the braid take shape. He thought about how strange life was, how a man could spend years believing he knew the shape of his own future, only to wake up one morning and find it completely rearranged. He had never imagined himself as the one standing at this sink, the one doing the braiding, the one who knew which detangler spray didn't sting her eyes, and which barrettes were her favorites, and how she liked exactly 2 bobby pins, no more, no less. These had been a mother's tasks in his old understanding of the world, and he'd carried that assumption without ever questioning it. But the world had not asked his permission before changing, and so he had changed with it. He reached the bottom of the braid and slipped the pink tie from his wrist, winding it carefully into place. "There," he said, lifting her hair so she could see the finished work in the mirror. Lily turned her head this way and that, examining it, and then she beamed. "It's beautiful, Daddy," she declared, and she spun around on the step stool to throw her arms around his neck. He caught her, holding her small, warm body against his chest, feeling her heart beat quick and certain, like a little bird's. In that moment, with the white light filling the room and his daughter's arms around him, Daniel understood something he hadn't been able to put into words before. The things that had been taken from him, the things Sarah had packed into boxes and carried away, none of them had ever held this kind of weight. This was the only thing that mattered. This small, fierce, beautiful love, learning to braid hair at a speckled bathroom mirror, was everything. Mornings in the new life had their own quiet poetry, and breakfast had become one of Daniel's favorite parts of the day, even though it happened on the bare living room floor instead of at a proper table. They'd sold the kitchen table set in the divorce, or rather Sarah had taken the good one, and the rest had simply gone with her, and Daniel hadn't yet gotten around to buying a new one. There were always more pressing things. The rent and the daycare and the small mountain of bills that seemed to regenerate no matter how carefully he paid them down. So for now, he and Lily sat cross-legged on the floor of the almost empty living room, eating cereal from mismatched bowls. Hers the chipped blue one with the cartoon rabbit, his a plain white one that had survived from his college days. The early morning light came through the window in long blue-gold streaks, falling across the wide bare floorboards, and it made the emptiness of the room look almost beautiful, like a canvas waiting for something, rather than a space stripped of what it used to hold. Lily ate her cereal with great concentration, fishing out the marshmallow pieces first the way she always did, lining them up on the edge of her bowl to save for last. Daniel watched her with a kind of quiet wonder, the way she'd build her own little rituals into everything, the way children turn the smallest acts into ceremonies. He thought about how he used to rush through breakfast in the old life, standing at the counter, scrolling through his phone, barely tasting the food, his mind already 3 steps ahead at work. Now there was nowhere he needed to be faster than right here. He'd cut back his hours, taken a job closer to home, learned to live on less so he could be more. And these slow floor breakfasts, in their cracked bowls, in their empty room, had become more precious to him than any fancy meal he'd ever eaten.
"Daddy,"
Lily said around a mouthful of cereal, "why don't we have a table anymore?" He paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He'd known the question would come eventually. "We're going to get one," he said, "when the time is right. But you know what? Sitting on the floor isn't so bad, is it?" Lily considered this, looking around the room at the wide open space where a table and chairs and a couch and a coffee table had all once stood. "It's like a picnic," she decided, finally brightening. "We have a picnic every morning." And just like that, she'd taken what could have been a wound and turned it into something whole. Daniel felt his throat tighten, and he looked down at his cereal, blinking quickly. Children had a way of doing that, of saving you when you thought you were the one doing all the saving. "Yeah," he said, his voice a little rough. "It's a picnic. The best kind." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft clink of spoons against bowls and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a bird was singing somewhere in the maple tree by the window, and the blue-gold light kept shifting as the sun rose higher. Daniel thought about all the things he'd been afraid of when Sarah first left, all the certainties he'd lost. He'd been terrified that he wouldn't be enough, that a child needed more than one parent, that Lily would grow up feeling the hole where her mother should have been. And maybe she would, in some ways, someday. But sitting here on the floor, watching her save her marshmallows for last, watching her turn an empty room into a picnic, he began to believe that love might be enough after all. Not perfect, not whole, in the way it once was, but enough. He reached over and stole one of her marshmallows, and she gasped in mock outrage, and they both dissolved into laughter that filled the bare room better than any furniture ever could. Nighttime had its own particular gravity in the little house, a heaviness that pulled at Daniel after the long stretch of single-handed parenting that each day demanded. By evening, he was always running on the last reserves of himself, and yet these were also the moments he treasured most, the soft, quiet rituals of putting his daughter to bed. 1. Tonight Lily had fallen asleep on the couch during their evening cartoon, the way she sometimes did, her body going limp and heavy against the cushions, her thumb drifting toward her mouth out of an old habit she was slowly outgrowing. Daniel had sat with her a while, not wanting to disturb the rare peace of it, just watching the rise and fall of her small chest, the flutter of her eyelids as she dreamed whatever dreams little ones dream. Then carefully he had gathered her into his arms. She weighed more than she used to, growing as children do when you're not paying attention, and his back protested as he stood. But he held her close and began the slow walk down the dim hallway toward her room. Her head rested heavily on his shoulder, her cheek warm against his neck, and one small arm draped loosely around him. Her fingers curled into the collar of his shirt, as if even in sleep she needed to hold on. The hallway was dark, except for the soft amber glow spilling from the open doorway of her bedroom ahead, where he'd left the little lamp on. He walked slowly, savoring the weight of her, the trust of her, the way she surrendered so completely into his arms. He thought about how someday she would be too big to carry, how there would come a last time he held her like this, and he wouldn't even know it was the last time until it had already passed. The thought caught in his chest sharp and sweet all at once. He pressed his lips gently to the top of her head as he walked, breathing in the smell of her hair, the strawberry shampoo gone faint, now beneath the warm scent of sleep. Halfway down the hall, she stirred, mumbling something he couldn't make out, and then she settled again, her arm tightening briefly around his neck. "Daddy," she whispered, barely awake. "I'm here," he murmured back. He kept walking. The lamplight grew warmer and closer, the doorway widening as he approached, and he thought about all the nights ahead of him, all the bedtimes and the carryings and the gentle layings down, and he understood that this was his life now, this quiet devotion, this steady presence in the dark. There had been nights, in the first weeks after Sarah left, when he had carried Lily to bed and then gone to his own room, and wept into his pillow, terrified and exhausted, and so deeply alone that he didn't know how he would survive until morning. He'd lain awake doing arithmetic in his head, the money and the hours and the impossible math of doing everything alone. He'd wondered if he was failing her, if a single tired father could ever be enough to fill a whole childhood. But somewhere in those long, dark nights, something had shifted. He'd stopped counting what was missing and started seeing what was here. And what was here, sleeping warm and heavy against his shoulder, was worth every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar stretched and every dream deferred. He reached her doorway and stepped into the warm circle of lamplight, crossing to the small bed with its pale quilt turned down. Gently, so gently, he lowered her onto the mattress, easing his arm out from beneath her, holding his breath as she resettled. He pulled the quilt up to her chin and brushed the hair back from her forehead. She sighed in her sleep, a small contented sound, and Daniel stood there for a long moment looking down at her, marveling that something so small could hold up the entire weight of a grown man's world without ever knowing it. The afternoon at the park was the kind of ordinary perfect that Daniel had learned to recognize and hold on to, the sort of moment that would have slipped right past him in his old life, but that he now collected like treasure. They'd gone after lunch, when the autumn sun was warm but not too hot, and Lily had run herself ragged on the playground, climbing and sliding and swinging, until her cheeks were flushed pink and her braided come half undone. Now they sat together on a low wooden bench at the edge of the park, resting the muted gold of the afternoon light, warming everything around them. The background of trees and grass and distant playing children softened into a gentle blur. Lily had scooted close to him on the bench, leaning against his side, and she'd slipped her small hand into his open palm, the way she always did, without thinking, without needing to be asked. Daniel looked down at it, that tiny hand resting completely inside his large weathered one, her fingers so small they barely spanned the width of his palm. There was something about the sight of it that stopped his breath every single time. His hands were rough and scarred and strong, hands that had worked hard his whole life, hands that had once held wrenches and lumber and the heavy machinery of his trade. And now they held this small, soft hand that trusted him completely, that reached for him in crowds and held tight when she was scared and rested in his palm when she was simply happy and at peace. He closed his fingers gently around hers, careful the way you hold something infinitely precious and fragile. She didn't look up. She was watching a squirrel dart across the grass, her whole attention captured by the small drama of it, and she had no idea that her father was sitting beside her on the verge of tears over the simple weight of her hand in his. Daniel thought about the day Sarah had left for good. He thought about standing in the doorway, watching her car pull away, the trunk packed with the last of the boxes, and how the silence afterward had been so total it felt like the world had ended. He'd turned around and found Lily standing in the hallway, in her pajamas clutching her stuffed rabbit, looking up at him with eyes that asked 1,000 questions she didn't have words for. And he'd knelt down and opened his arms, and she'd run into them, and her small hand had gripped his shirt, and in that moment he'd made a silent promise that he would never let go, that no matter what else he lost, he would hold on to this. Sarah had taken so much. She'd taken the furniture and the photographs and the savings and the comfortable certainty of a two-parent home. But she had left behind this hand, this small, trusting hand that fit so perfectly inside his own, and she had never understood that. In leaving it behind, she had left him everything. "Daddy," Lily said, suddenly breaking his reverie, "can we feed the ducks?" There were no ducks at this park, only the squirrel and a few pigeons, but Daniel smiled and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Not today, sweetheart," he said. "But maybe we'll find some ducks another day." "'Kay," she said easily, unbothered. And she leaned her head against his arm. They sat there together in the golden light, the world blurred and soft around them, her hand in his, and Daniel let himself simply be present in it, fully, completely. He'd spent so much of his life racing towards some future that always seemed just out of reach, some idea of success and security, and having enough. But sitting here on this bench, with his daughter's hand resting in his palm, he understood that he already had more than enough. He had the only thing that mattered, and he was never, ever going to let it go. Bedtime stories had become sacred in their household, the final ritual that bookended each day and tucked it gently to rest. Tonight Daniel sat on the edge of Lily's low toddler bed, the mattress dipping under his weight, a worn picture book open across his knees. The room was dim except for the single bedside lamp, which cast a warm golden circle of light around the two of them, leaving the corners of the room in soft shadow. Lily was tucked under her pale quilt, only her face peeking out, and she watched him read, with an intensity that always moved him, her eyes fixed on his face rather than the pictures, as if the story lived in him and not on the page. He read slowly, doing all the voices the way she liked, The gruff bear voice and the squeaky mouse voice and the wise old owl who spoke in long, thoughtful sentences. He'd read this particular book so many times, knew it by heart, could have recited it in his sleep, but he never rushed it, never skipped a page, even when his eyes were heavy and his whole body ached for rest. Because these were the moments that would build the foundation of who she became. The small, daily proofs that she was loved, that she was safe, that someone would always sit at the edge of her bed and read to her in the warm lamplight no matter how tired they were. He turned a page, and Lily reached out from under the quilt to point at one of the pictures. The bear hugging the little mouse. And she said, "That's like us, Daddy. The big one and the little one." Daniel felt something catch in his chest. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's just like us." She smiled, satisfied, and pulled her arm back under the warmth of the quilt. He kept reading, his voice low and gentle, filling the small golden room with the steady rhythm of the story. He thought about his own childhood, about the father he'd had, a hard-working, distant man who'd loved him in his way, but who'd never once sat on the edge of his bed and read him a story. Daniel had grown up believing that fathers were providers, that their love was expressed through labor and sacrifice and the quiet endurance of difficult work, not through softness or tenderness or bedtime stories. He'd carried that belief into his own marriage without ever examining it, leaving the soft work of parenting to Sarah, while he played the role he thought a father was supposed to play. And then Sarah had left, and suddenly there was no one to do the soft work but him, and he discovered to his great surprise that he was good at it, that he loved it. That this, sitting on the edge of a small bed reading about a bear and a mouse, was the work he'd been waiting his whole life to do without ever knowing it. He reached the last page, where the bear tucked the little mouse into bed and told him good night, and he closed the book gently. Lily's eyes were drooping now, heavy with sleep, but she was fighting it the way she always did, not wanting the day to end. "One more," she murmured. "Not tonight, sweetheart," he said, setting the book on the nightstand. "It's time to sleep now." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, breathing in the warm, sleepy smell of her. "I love you all the way to the moon," he whispered. The thing he said every night. "And back," she mumbled, finishing it, her voice thick and slow. "And back," he agreed. He reached over and switched off the lamp, and the room went soft and dark. Just the faint glow of her nightlight in the corner. He sat there for another minute in the darkness, listening to her breathing slow and deepen, watching the small shape of her settle into sleep, and he thought that he would trade nothing in the world, not all the comfort, or money, or ease he'd lost, for this single quiet moment in the dark beside his sleeping child. The kitchen in the early evening was Daniel's favorite kind of chaos, warm and steamy and alive, with the small, busy energy of dinner being made. He stood at the small stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce, the recipe one he'd cobbled together from memory and trial and error over the past year. And beside him, Lily was perched on her step-stool, pushed up on her tiptoes, trying to peek into the pot. The warm kitchen light glowed amber against both their faces, and the windows had fogged slightly with the steam, the cold autumn evening pressing dark against the glass outside. "Careful, sweetheart," Daniel said, gently easing her back from the heat. "It's hot," but she leaned in again, irresistibly drawn, her nose wrinkling at the smell. "What is it?" she asked. "It's our special sauce," he said, and she nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world. He'd never been much of a cook before. In the old life, Sarah had done most of the cooking, and Daniel had been content with whatever was put in front of him, never thinking much about it. But when she left, he'd faced the daunting reality of feeding a small picky child 3 meals a day, and so he'd taught himself, one disaster at a time. There had been burnt-grilled cheese and lumpy oatmeal, and at least one memorable night when he'd set off the smoke detector, and they'd had cereal for dinner instead. Lily had laughed about that for weeks. But slowly, patiently, he'd gotten the hang of it. He'd learned which vegetables she'd eat if you hid them in the sauce, and which ones she'd never touch. He'd learned to make her favorite pancakes on Sunday mornings, shaped like lopsided animals. And he'd discovered, in the process, a kind of joy he'd never expected. The simple satisfaction of nourishing someone you love, of standing at a stove with your child beside you, working together on the small daily project of staying alive and well. "Can I stir?" Lily asked. Daniel hesitated, then handed her the wooden spoon, keeping his hand over hers to guide it, helping her move the sauce in slow, careful circles. "Like this," he said. She stirred with intense concentration, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth, and he watched her with a fullness in his chest that he could hardly name. He thought about all the things people said you needed to give a child a good life: the two-parent home, the financial stability, the big house, the right neighborhood. He thought about how by all those measures he was failing. They lived in a small rented place with almost no furniture. Money was always tight. There was only one of him, doing the work of two. But standing here at the stove, with his daughter's hand under his, on the wooden spoon, with the amber light warm on their faces, and the good smell of dinner filling the little kitchen, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt like the richest man alive. "Good job," he said, taking the spoon back. "You're a natural." Lily beamed with pride. "When I grow up," she announced, "I'm going to be a cook, just like you." The words landed soft and warm in his chest, "just like you," and he had to turn toward the pot for a moment to compose himself. He thought about how children become what they see, how the small daily example of a present and loving parent could shape an entire life. He thought about the kind of man she might love someday, the kind of partner, the kind of parent she herself might become, and how all of it would be built in part on these ordinary evenings, in this warm, small kitchen. "Come on," he said, his voice a little thick. "Let's set out the bowls. Dinner's almost ready." And she scrambled down from her stool to help, and the kitchen glowed amber and warm around them both. Long after Lily was asleep, when the house had gone quiet and still and dark, Daniel did the work that no one ever saw. Tonight it was laundry. A basket of it balanced beside him on the couch as he folded in the dim glow of a single lamp, the only light in the otherwise darkened room. He was bone-tired, the kind of tired that lived deep in the muscles, the accumulated exhaustion of 1,000 days of doing everything alone. His eyes burned and his shoulders ached, but the laundry had to be done, because tomorrow Lily would need clean clothes, and there was no one else to do it. He worked through the basket methodically, folding her tiny shirts and pants, matching the impossibly small socks. He came to a pair of them now, soft little socks with strawberries printed on them, and he held them in his rough hands for a long moment, his expression going quietly tender. They were so small. They fit in the palm of his hand. He remembered when she was a baby, when Sarah was still there, and they'd marveled together at how tiny everything was, the little socks and the little hats and the impossibly small fingernails. They'd been a team then, or he'd thought they were. He folded the socks together and set them on the pile, and he let himself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of how hard this was. People didn't talk much about this part. They talked about the heartbreak of the leaving, the drama of the split. But they didn't talk about this, the quiet, relentless grind of the after, the laundry folded alone at midnight, the bone-deep loneliness of carrying a whole family on one set of shoulders. There were nights when he wondered if he was doing it right, nights when he second-guessed every decision, when the worry about money and the future and whether Lily would be okay pressed down on him so hard he could barely breathe. Nights when he missed, not Sarah exactly, but the simple presence of another adult, someone to share the load, someone to say you're doing fine, someone to fold the other half of the laundry. He set down the shirt he was folding and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. He was so tired. But even in the exhaustion, even in the loneliness, there was something underneath it, something steady and unshakable that kept him going. It was the thought of her face, and the way she looked at him in the morning when she first woke up, that pure, unfiltered joy at finding him there. The way she reached for his hand without thinking. The way she'd said, "When I grow up, I'm going to be a cook. Just like you." He picked the strawberry socks back up and held them again. Sarah had left and taken so much, but she'd left this. She'd left him a daughter who loved him, who needed him, who was growing up safe and happy and whole because he had decided every single day to stay, to show up, to do the laundry at midnight and braid the hair in the morning, and read the same story for the 100th time, and stir the sauce and carry her sleeping body down the dark hall. Sarah had walked away from all of it, and Daniel sometimes wondered if she even understood what she'd given up. He didn't think she did. He thought, with a sadness that held no anger anymore, only a quiet pity, that she had no idea what she'd left behind. She'd taken the furniture and the photographs and the savings, but the one thing she didn't know he'd keep, the one thing that turned out to be the only thing worth keeping, was this. A little girl. A whole future. A love that asked nothing and gave everything. He finished folding the laundry, stacked it neatly in the basket, and turned off the lamp. In the darkness, he sat for a moment longer, and then he smiled. He was so tired. But he was not, he realized, alone. Not anymore, not ever again. The seasons turned the way they always do, slow and then sudden, and on a golden autumn evening, Daniel and Lily walked hand in hand down a quiet, tree-lined sidewalk, their long shadows stretching out ahead of them on the path. She was bigger now, her braid neater, her steps surer, but her tiny frame still barely reached his hip, and her small hand was still tucked safely inside his. The trees overhead had turned amber and gold, and the late sun fell through the branches in long, warm shafts, lighting the leaves that drifted down around them like slow, gentle snow. They weren't going anywhere in particular. Sometimes they just walked, the two of them, after dinner, when the evening was soft, the day was winding down. Lily liked to count the leaves and step on the crunchy ones, and Daniel liked the simple peace of it, the rhythm of their footsteps, the warmth of her hand, the quiet that didn't ache anymore the way it once had. So much had changed since the night Sarah drove away with the trunk full of boxes. The empty house had slowly filled again, not with the same things, but with new ones. A small kitchen table found secondhand, a soft worn couch, a bookshelf full of picture books. The bareness had given way to a different kind of fullness, a life rebuilt, from the foundation up, brick by brick, day by day. Daniel had stopped grieving what was lost and started cherishing what remained. He'd learned that a family wasn't measured by its number, that a home wasn't measured by its furniture, that love wasn't diminished by being carried on a single pair of shoulders. If anything, it had only grown stronger, more concentrated, fiercer. For being so fully given. "Daddy," Lily said, looking up at him as they walked, "are we a real family?" He stopped, right there on the golden sidewalk, and knelt down to her level, the way he always did when something mattered. He looked into her eyes, those eyes that held so much of her mother and so much of himself, and he took both her small hands in his. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice steady and sure, "you and me, we are the realest family there is." She studied his face for a moment, searching it the way children do. And then she smiled, satisfied, and threw her arms around his neck. He held her there on the sidewalk in the golden light, the leaves drifting down around them, and he closed his eyes and breathed her in. He thought about the man he'd been before, the tired, distant provider who thought love was something you proved through work and sacrifice from a careful distance. He thought about how much he would have missed if Sarah hadn't left, how he might have gone his whole life never knowing the weight of a sleeping child against his shoulder, never learning to braid hair, or make pancakes shaped like animals, or do all the voices in a bedtime story. In the breaking, something had been built. In the leaving, something had been kept. He stood up, lifting her with him, and she settled onto his hip, her head resting against his shoulder, and they continued down the sidewalk into the gold and quiet evening. Sarah had taken everything she thought was worth taking. White, but she had left behind the one thing she never understood the value of, the one thing he would have given his very life to keep. And as Daniel walked into the golden light with his daughter in his arms, their shadows long and joined together on the path ahead, he knew with a certainty that filled him to the brim that he was the luckiest man who had ever lived. He had stayed, and in staying he had found everything, and nothing in this world, nothing at all, would ever take it from him again.